My name is Mike. Hello, Graham.
Yeah, I'm Graham.
Let's start our conversation by looking at three issues, Graham. Why is this topic important empirically and conceptually? What are the key conceptual approaches which actually have been discussed in our special issue on the politicization and political contests in multinational corporations? And also, what are the directions of future research which are mentioned in the papers, 5 papers of our special issue?
Yeah, and I think we have to say that multinationals are very much in the news at the moment. For example, Facebook, Enron and so on. And one of the issues is that the relationship between government and multinationals is becoming quite strained. And the power issues are really brought to the surface by these contemporary developments. So within that sort of context, we're looking at some of the key conceptual approaches we can use to understand politics and power in the modern multinational corporation. So let's bring in Stewart at this point.
If we're going to think about MNCs in political terms, then I think it's fairly obvious that we have to think of the way in which they're intermediaries in whole systems of flows of capital, flows of political influence, flows of trade. So the crucial issue is looking at the way in which the MNCs position themselves as what I call, after some other scholars, obligatory passage points. How do they position themselves in such a way that they're able to essentially exercise some control over the traffic that passes through them and which they orchestrate? If we think about what it is that MNCs want, and we think about what states want, there are clearly some complementarities and clearly some contradictions. I mean, on the one hand, developed states and developing states want to raise income to be able to spend on their priorities, through taxation, on public works, infrastructure, welfare, and other sorts of expenditures. On the other hand, multinational companies are oriented towards maximizing their returns for shareholders, and there's clearly a contradiction between the two, because if more money goes in taxation to the countries in which they operate, then there will be less profit available to be distributed to shareholders. And we see the consequences of this in many of the decisions that are made locationally and spatially by multinationals. I mean, it's no accident that so many of them are domiciled, for instance, in the United States, in Massachusetts, because it has very favorable tax regime for companies. In Europe, in the Netherlands, and in Ireland, and we know that in ERA, the the tax rates are very favorable to corporations. And so we have the fictions that ensue of companies such as Starbucks and Apple and other companies which are major multinational companies, claiming that they are actually headquartered in places like Singapore or ERA, and that they're charging fairly substantial amounts of money to their subsidiaries in countries like Australia vis-a-vis Singapore, or the United Kingdom vis-a-vis ERA, to use intellectual property as well as having transfer pricing in play as well. So consequently, a great deal of the flows of capital are eliding and eluding the scrutiny of many governments. On the other hand, the governments themselves feel often the governments have the view that we don't want to scare capital away. We need the capital investment, and if we come down too heavily on them, they will go elsewhere. Now, there isn't a lot of evidence to suggest that capital is quite as mobile as this hypothesis suggests, but we now are in a position, particularly as a result of the tax changes introduced by President Trump in the USA, where there is a kind of a race to the bottom.
Thanks, Stewart. What Stewart pointed to actually in our special issue is that there's an increased politicization from the inside and from the outside. So some academics actually talk about the multinationals as the masters of the universe. They question the political role of multinational corporations in public, but also in academic discourses. Other scholars point to the internal politics of multinational corporations and see that multinationals become more and more battlefields, like Christensen and Seidlin. So the last approach very much deals with micropolitics and discursive struggles in multinational corporations. So the former scholars, the micropolitics scholars, talk about the fight for resources between headquarters and subsidiaries, between labor and management, between different key actors, political power players in multinational corporations. They also point to interest conflicts between them and the contests emerging out of that. And the discourse of studies, they stress very much the sense-making issues, the political sense-making issues and political identity issues or identity politics, why actors in certain discourses about globalization, about national politics, actually get involved internally in political infighting.
Yeah, but I think a problem so far is that the internal debates and the internal theorization has not been connected to the external environment around multinational corporations and ideologies around multinational corporations in the external environment. So there's been a lot of discussion about corporate social responsibility, but we think that's at quite a normative level. And what's really needed for CSR to really bite on multinational corporations is transnational agreements between the major stakeholders outside multinational corporations. Another problem about CSR issues is that it relies on institutional stability in the countries in which it's applying. And of course, a lot of issues around multinationals now concern global value chains and expansion into the developing world, where institutional frameworks and regulative frameworks are not very well established. Another issue outside multinational corporations is the whole idea of branding and the ideologies being imposed from the outside in big companies. So we have to look at that and think about the dysfunctions of how branding impacts upon the multinational corporation itself. Some of the asymmetries in power relations around that branding, and indeed a hegemonic class that's financializing relationships within multinational corporations, particularly in those big corporations, maybe not so much in the small fragmented ones, but in those large multinational corporations, which are often more powerful than government. So we have to connect those external issues with internal debates on multinational corporations.
Yeah, but there's not much traffic between two camps, and that's probably one reason why we set up the special issue between the micropolitics or micro camp and the macropolitics or the macro camp. One reason for that, I think, Graham, is really that there's a lot of academic specialization. So, for instance, in IB, they very lately picked up on micropolitics, and they picked up very much in a very functionalist way. They talk about that actually politics have to be managed in a way managed out of multinational corporations. They don't see it as a national cause. So they see it as a disturbance of efficient functions of the multinational corporations. And then there's, as you said already, the political CSR camp, which sees multinationals as political actors. But they don't talk much about, as you said, about issues, internal power relations, how they affect how multinationals become political actors or even become nasty political actors. So this is really missing.
Yeah. And there's a need really to be interdisciplinary in the approach, and that's what we've done in this special issue. We have to draw more deeply on the social sciences in general, maybe on sociology and economic geography, to broaden the debate and to make the debate more critical. So that's what we've done. And so in terms of the contributions we've had to this special issue, for example, Pedraza Acosta and Muritzen have undertaken an empirical study dealing with the destructive effects of dominant financialization ideology on an entire production network. So they are actually connecting in a very subtle way the internal and external effects and really homing in on some of those power relations and the contests within supply chains. Mezi-Hourak is, again, it's an empirical study, and it's looking at the effects of relocation activities in MNCs to a shared service centre. Again, that's highlighting politicization both outside and within multinational corporations when outsourcing occurs. And it's looking at a central debate of the conflicts which occur between the headquarters and lower level management within multinational corporations.
Thanks, Graham. Both papers looked actually at circuits of power framework, how the circuits of power framework helps us to connect micro and macro. That's an approach where Stewart Clegg has very much contributed to. I want to introduce a last three papers of our special issue. There's one by Levy and Reiche. It's a conceptual paper, and they talk about the internal politicization of MNCs, which transform from traditional hierarchical organizations into global networks. And the key question is how hierarchy in multinational corporations is culturally produced, contested and reproduced. And then we have a paper by McLean and others. She actually and her colleagues provide an empirical historical study which looks into the question of political ideologies. And they use the example of the Hilton Hotel Group and how they influenced discourse of sense-making by pointing to issues like rhetoric, networking, and political leads in the US, and how that actually cultivated bureaucratic support in the host countries. So the question was how macro and micropolitics are driven by political ideologies which have global impact. And the last paper in our special issue is a paper by Banerjee. It's a critique of political CSR, actually, and it focuses on MNCs and dealings with marginalized stakeholders in emerging economies. He used the example of extracting industries, mining industries, and raises important questions about translocational CSR and how multinational corporations deal with repressive states and how MNCs deal with impacted or the dealings of MNCs impacted local communities, and they suggest ways to address it in a better manner.
Yeah. So I think we have to turn to future research directions, and the circuits of power approach can really help us in understanding new developments in multinational corporations. It seems to be the case that digital technologies and new accounting methods are perpetuating the existing asymmetry in multinational corporations, where there's a dislocation between CEOs and the transnational capital class, if there is such a thing, and workers and communities. So I think given new examples that we're hearing about, for example, Facebook, we can really apply the circuits of power framework to understand what's going on in the contemporary environment. Secondly, we really have to recognize the significance of nation states. Although a lot of the globalization debate has implied that nation states are relatively powerless, obviously they can have a significant influence on developments. And it depends to an extent on institutional frameworks within nation states. So for example, in the coordinated market economies, governments can have a major role on investments in their countries, as well as internal industrial relations systems and labor laws and so on. So we shouldn't lose the significance of the nation state from our deliberations on power and politics in multinationals.
Thanks, Graham. I think the last three are also very important directions our contributions point to. One is actually the importance of dominant ideologies. The paper of McLean and others, they talk about a communist ideology, but what we have now is a dominant neoliberal ideology and how that affects internal and external relations of multinational corporations. Another important topic is really labor. I mean, lots of discourses or discussions about politics and power are about management. But it's also the relation between management and labor, which needs to be looked into. And we have papers who do that. For instance, the papers Matsuriak, Barjani, and also Pedraza and Moritzen. And the role of hierarchy. I mean, on the one hand, lots of IB stuff makes us pretend that it will all end up in global networks. But we have seen in our papers that social hierarchy plays still a very important role. It will not disappear, and there's much more research needed how hierarchy works in a more informal, in a less formal way in multinational corporations in a political context. I think we are done. So we just want to say we hope our audience likes to read the special issue, and we are looking forward to discussions, future discussions on the topics if you meet our peers and also practitioners who are interested in the topic.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.